Hello everyone, PSYMAGE here, and this is my latest fight stick. This is a modded Virtua Stick High Grade from the PlayStation 3 era. Now, it was a long story to get to this point, and I'm going to go into that story in a little bit, but I want to first start off by talking about what is inside of this fight stick. Because as you can see here, this is no longer your typical Virtua Stick High Grade. So first off, instead of a joystick, I have the Odin V2 here. So these are WASD keys, turning this into a mixed box type of setup. Now, typically speaking, I play on a WASD setup like this for platformers, some 2D racing games, and some other 2D games that are not fighting games or shoot 'em ups. Typically for fighting games and shoot 'em ups, I'm more likely to go with my modded Mad Catz Fightstick Pro, which has a golden lever inside of it. Though lately I actually have been trying this out with shmups, and it has really surprised me in terms of performance, in terms of being able to dodge. And also the micro switches here are clicky, and they feel great. Now above that, these are the option buttons. So I replaced the original yellow option buttons with the Sanwa 18mm push buttons. Now, these buttons are quite heavy to push down, but they do actuate fairly early, so they are kind of sensitive. They do the job. They're not amazing buttons, but for their purpose, they work. Now, below that, these are Sitong MX buttons from China. These are, if I recall correctly, these are the STM4 model. These feel fantastic. So I've been playing with these for about a month now, maybe a little bit less than that, and they are amazing, especially for the price. I got these for a little over $3 a button off of AliExpress. I can highly recommend them, especially for that price. And here we have, this is a Seimitsu button here. This is 24mm. Now, what's great about having a Seimitsu button here as my start button is that it's not very sensitive like a regular Sanwa button is, so you don't have to worry about pressing it accidentally. And inside of it, I have it's an RP2040 Advanced Breakout Board, which supports the GP2040 CE firmware. I have that, and also I have over here, I have the Nutrix connector. I'll have a picture of that in the corner somewhere whenever I am done editing this. And the Nutrix allows me to connect a USB cable, USB-B to USB-A to my PC. Or, because the GP2040 supports the Nintendo Switch, I could plug it into a Nintendo Switch and also a PS3. But I'm a PC player, so I'm going to be using this on my PC. But anyways, that sums up what's inside of this fight stick at this point. I want to get into the story about how I got to this point, because it was a lot more work than I expected. But I'm very happy with the results. So where do I start? So originally I ordered this fight stick off of eBay. It was supposed to come with a GP2040 CE PCB, Sanwa parts, so a Sanwa JLF, Sanwa buttons for 24mm right here, and the 30mm buttons. They were all supposed to be Sanwa. It did have the original option buttons at the top instead of these, and they were for some reason painted black. And also the carriage bolts. The previous owner had attempted to paint these black as well. And I'm going to get back to that later, because that's going to be probably the root of a lot of my problems. But where did the problems really begin though? Well, everything looked great when I first got it in the mail. Sanwa parts. The body of it looked pretty good, considering it's an older fight stick. I didn't suspect anything right away, and it had the Nutrix connector. Now, when I went to plug in this fight stick to my PC, I first tried getting into the GP2040CE web configurator and I couldn't get into it. So then I did LSUSB because I'm on Linux. So I went to the terminal, I did LSUSB to see what this device was identified as. And what happened was when I did that, it showed up as 0Pi or 0Pad, which is the indicator of a Brook PCB and not a GP2040CE PCB. If it was a GP2040CE compatible PCB, it would have said tiny USB instead. So I knew right then and there something was up. So then I went to open this thing up, and that's where the real trouble began. So for those of you that don't already know, the Virtua Stick High Grade is a pain in the rear end to open up. You have to take off the bottom plate. And then, in order to get access to the parts inside, you have to take off the top plate here. But the top plate is secured by these carriage bolts. And there's 6 of them. And underneath, there are hex nuts that you have to remove from the bottom with a special hex nut driver, which I have here. I bought one of these off of Amazon right before I got this in the mail because I knew I was going to need it. So when I go to take off the nuts that secure the carriage bolts in place, half of them come out just fine. Half of the carriage bolts, that is. But then there were 3 carriage bolts that were just stuck. They were stuck into place. They just weren't coming out. And it's very tight working inside of this case. So I ended up getting the smallest pliers that I had. And for me, it was an M.2 screw removal plier. Yeah, that's what these pliers are made for, removing stripped M.2 screws. And I went to work trying to get these out, these remaining carriage bolts out. And I had to wrestle with them. And it took me about 30 minutes or so to get the remaining carriage bolts out, to figure out how to really just get them out. It really just took me wrestling with them, kind of just shaking them back and forth with the pliers. Absolute nightmare. I was wondering, like, what in the world is going on here? But then once I got the carriage bolts out, the remaining ones, I think I got a good clue. So I look at them and I notice that the black paint that was on the carriage bolts from the previous owner, because for some reason the previous owner had this genius idea of painting the carriage bolts black and the yellow option buttons black in order to match the body of the Fightstick. The problem was, whenever the previous owner did this, the black paint went inside of the Fightstick, at least into the carriage bolts, the threading. So what happened was, and this is my theory at least, the paint hardened and these carriage bolts got stuck on the inside. And that's why a lot of those carriage bolts were so hard to get out. Now, another problem after that was the remaining carriage bolts that I had to wrestle with, the threads on them were damaged. Now, I'm not sure whether I had damaged them with the pliers wrestling them out or they were like that before. I really don't know. But I had to replace these carriage bolts now. So I had to do a bunch of research and figure out that these were M4 size carriage bolts. So thankfully, I was able to get these off of Amazon after figuring out that they were M4 size. And it took a few days or so for them to come in, but they did. And thankfully, they fit. But then wait a minute, there was one more problem though. And I'm almost forgetting this. Once I finally got this thing opened up, my suspicion about this PCB not being a GP2040CE PCB was correct, because it turned out that it was a Brook PCB in there. It was an old Brook PS3/PS4 fighting board, and it was one of those really old models that's square. It doesn't even have the 20-pin connector on it for the 20-pin harness. That's how old it was. So that's why I couldn't get into the web configurator at first, because it wasn't a GP2040CE after all. And remember, the listing on eBay said it was supposed to be GP2040CE. They did not say Brook PCB, they said GP2040CE PCB. So, anyways though, mystery solved at this point. I also decided I'm going to get some new option buttons here, so that's why I got the 18mm Sanwas. I waited for those to come in as well, along with the new PCB. And I decided to get that new 24mm Seimitsu start button right here to match the option buttons on the top. So once everything else finally comes in, the Odin V2 had been in by this point. My plan was always to put in the Odin V2 and replace these face buttons right here. But anyways though, once everything's in, I gotta redo all the wiring. I ended up getting a 20-pin harness from Brook. I got the GP2040CE PCB. It's an RP2040 advanced breakout board like I mentioned earlier. So I installed it. I ended up figuring out a good place to install it from watching Scanline City's video on the Virtua Stick High Grade. I highly recommend checking that out. If you don't know a whole lot about the Virtua Stick High Grade, highly recommended video, excellent production values. The guy who does that channel, he is amazing. But anyways though, I get the new PCB installed. I put the 20-pin harness on it. I also had an extra connector so I could hook up and some extra buttons here and there. Particularly here, this button right here. And I get everything wired up. Very tight fit, by the way. There's not a lot of room to work inside of that case. But once I get everything wired up the way I want it, the Odin V2, the buttons, the PCB, everything's connected. I end up putting it back together and everything is working as it should. Everything is working great at this point. I'm able to get into the GP2040CE web configurator. I did set up this button here. This is no longer a home button. This is now a turbo button. I don't need a home button, a dedicated one, with this PCB because I can do up, select, and start for home on GP2040CE firmware, which is really handy, especially on a Fightstick like this, which is missing a few buttons here and there. But anyways, everything is, at this point, is working wonderfully. Everything's the way that I want it. All the wiring's done. And I love this Fightstick. I love the Odin V2 the way that it feels. I like it more than the T-Spin, which I was using for a while on my Quamba Crystal that I have. So I actually have 3 Fightsticks at this point. But there is a moral to this story. Be careful when you're buying modded Fightsticks off of eBay. The thing that you need to look out for, don't just look out for the outside of Fightstick. If somebody claims that they modded it with a Brook PCB or a GP2040CE PCB, make sure you see a picture of the inside with the PCB in there. The big mistake that I made when I bought this thing was there were no pictures of the PCB inside of it. I just took the previous owner's word for it, or at least the seller's word for it, in case the seller was not the previous owner. Be very careful whenever you buy things off of eBay. Look for pictures, not just, like I said, not just the outside, because everything here looked fine on the outside. Yeah, sure, the owner did this goofy thing where he painted the carriage bolts black and the yellow option buttons black. I didn't think much of it at the time. That was another thing. I should have been more wary of that as well. But be careful what's inside as well. Because if I wasn't somebody who was willing to get my hands dirty and mod, this would have been an absolute nightmare. I would have felt ripped off. But anyways, that is going to be it for this story. A lot of work, a lot more work than it should have been. It cost more money than it should have at the end of the day. But I am happy with the results. And also, this is a very sturdy case. It doesn't look big, but it's actually quite heavy. And it feels really nice in the lap. That's one other thing I wanted to say about the Virtua Stick High Grade in general. But anyways, everything is great. I love the GP2040CE PCB, the firmware, the web configurator. Everything is working great. And that is going to be it for this video. Let me know what you think of this mod, this Fightstick. It ended up being more of a project than it should have been. And let me know if you have any fight sticks. If you have a big collection or if you just have one, let me know. And also let me know if you've ever used, if you do have a fight stick, let me know if you have a Brook PCB or a GP2040 CE PCB. Anyways, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.